Situation 04 will take off from Denver International Airport and fly for 2 hours to George Bush Intercontinental Airport in Houston, Texas.
Receiving aircraft checklist complete. Want the you? Yeah.
Captain Butler is 50. He joined Continental 11 years ago. He will be the pilot flying to Houston. First Officer Levang is 34. He began flying with the airline a year ago. He will be monitoring the instruments and handling radio communications.
3-4 right. 3-4 right. That's all I want, right? Yep. Good evening, folks, from the flight deck. Captain Butler here and First Officer Levang. We're looking at a 1 hour and 52 minutes en route and don't anticipate any delays out of Denver. The ride should be pretty good all the way to Houston. We do appreciate your business. Welcome aboard.
Ground to cockpit.
Good evening.
Good evening, dude.
Dude?
Walk around has been completed. All doors, access panels closed, and web is ready.
Let me run a checklist and I'll be right back with you. Dude. All right, before start checklist.
Before start, seatbelt sign.
As the pilots run their checklist, passengers settle in. But Mike Wilson can only think about a previous flight 4 years ago.
My father had actually purchased a new aircraft, and he invited me out to go flying with him. You know, we'd taken off from a small airstrip near Galveston Bay in Houston, and once we got up flying out over the bay, we were kind of losing altitude. As soon as we hit the water, the plane sank just like a stone. So it took me a little while to kind of get back on the horse, I guess. What's the chances of being in 2 plane crashes?
Flight 1404 is approved to push back from the gate.
Hey, dude. Brakes released. You're clear to push tail east.
Okay, sir. You're clear to start.
Roger. I'm waiting for this thing to start sliding. I gotta love winter. Flaps. Set 5. Controls? Checked. Episode checklist complete. Ramp Continental 1404 ready to taxi.
1404, you'll follow at 1900 just off your right wingtip to 3 Whiskey. Have a good flight.
The ramp controller tells the crew to follow a much smaller Beech 1900 turboprop to runway 34 right. As the 5th busiest airport in the world, Denver's air traffic control tower is responsible for coordinating the arrival and departure of about 1,700 flights a day.
Continental 1404 Denver.
Tower. Runway 34 right. Position and hold.
Position and hold 34 right. Continental 1404.
Runway 34 right is one of 6 runways at Denver International.
They run 4 parallel runways that run from north to south, and there's 2 parallel runways east to west.
Set against the backdrop of the Rocky Mountains, it's the largest airport by total land area in the United States.
It's approximately 53 square miles, and the numbers don't do it justice. And once you're out there, it seems even bigger.
Want the ice protection on for takeoff?
No, let's kill it. Flight attendants, please be seated for departure. Continental 1404, wind 270 at 27.
Turn right. Heading 020.
Runway 34 right is cleared for takeoff.
The controller provides the pilots with a runway wind reading of 27 knots and clears them for takeoff.
Heading 020, cleared for takeoff, runway 34 right, Continental 1404.
We accelerated up to takeoff speed. Everything seemed like it was going just fine.
Suddenly, the plane veers hard to the left.
I felt a sharp left turn, and that's when things are definitely going wrong here.
Damn it!
The plane careens off the runway at a speed of more than 100 miles an hour. It's completely out of control.
Reject! Reject!
The first thought in my mind was, there's no way this is happening again.
The plane hits a steep ridge, sending it airborne.
It felt like we just went off a cliff. We dropped 50 feet or so. When we hit the bottom, that's when things got much, much worse. And I could see just flames coming from that right side engine.
This can't be happening!
We kept sliding forever.
Flight 1404 finally comes to a stop, 700 feet from the runway. But with the fire engulfing the plane's right engine, everyone on board is in life-threatening danger. It's a frightening repeat of British Air Tours Flight 28, which aborted takeoff due to an engine fire and had to be evacuated. 53 passengers and 2 crew members died because they couldn't get off the plane in time.
Tower, it looks like you had a plane go off on 3-4 right on the left side.
Say that again?
When the controller gets the news,
Plane go off on 3-4.
he can't account for one of his flights.
Continental 1404 Denver Tower. Continental 1404 Denver Tower, do you copy? All emergency units, this is the tower.
We have a crash.
Emergency vehicles race to the scene as flames consume the airliner.
The cabin was starting to fill with smoke. I looked over at the left-hand overwing exit, and it was already open.
Get out of this thing before it burns up, come on!
In the middle of the plane, there are no flight attendants, no crew there to help you, and so it's kind of Lord of the Flies.
Okay, don't panic and don't push!
Continental Flight 1404 is burning up. Thick smoke is pouring into the cabin. Passengers have only seconds to escape.
And if people aren't working together, it can get a little crazy.
Come on.
I carefully made it down the wing, got off onto the ground, and then turned, and I immediately started walking up the hill. I turned around, and that was the first time I actually saw the plane. I could see the whole plane just sort of silhouetted by the flames behind it. And the other passengers kind of straggling out up this hill. It hit me that, oh, I'm going to survive this.
Rescue crews search for the crashed plane, including firefighter Randall Kemp.
The sun had been down for almost 2 hours already, so it was pitch black. You couldn't see a thing. Denver International is challenging because it's such a large piece of land.
Firefighters finally pinpoint the plane's location off the runway and begin fighting the fire.
A lot of people think that it's flat like a billiard table, and I can assure you that it is anything but that. There's drop-offs in some areas that go down a few hundred feet, very close to where 1404 departed the runway.
Continental Flight 1404, en route to Houston, went sharply off the runway during takeoff, burst into flames, and nearly broke apart.
When rescue crews arrived, they described the scene as surreal, like something out of a movie. Firefighters were prepared to see dead bodies inside.
We got lucky with that terrain.
Where this aircraft wound up coming to a halt was on an incline.
Luckily, the fuel has flowed down the slope, away from the burning fuselage and escaping passengers. All 110 passengers and 5 flight crew narrowly escaped death. The captain is seriously wounded, and the first officer suffers minor injuries. The question now is, how could this have happened in the first place?
By daylight, the charred right side of the plane was visible from the air.
The next day shows the true scope of the disaster. The passengers and crew members are lucky to be alive. Investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board arrive at the crash site. They need to figure out what could have sent Flight 1404 off the runway. They gather evidence from the crash site for analysis.
Can we get 35 up here, please?
Bill English is the investigator in charge.
It's quite a ride.
The aircraft was pretty far off the runway. It had gone off at a very high speed, went over these other roadways. It was mostly intact. The fuselage was burned along most of the right side, and some pretty significant impact damage as it went across the infield.
Okay, let's see what those tracks tell us.
One of the first things we started to see was the tire marks starting to diverge from the center line, heading at a pretty significant angle off to the left.
Yeah, right there. Okay, the plane departs the runway to the left, crosses the taxiway and that service road, narrowly missing this fire station before coming to rest on that slope in the terrain. What's it look like to you?
Some kind of mechanical failure?
My money's on the rudder. For now.
A rudder is a control surface at the rear of the aircraft used to both steer the plane and counter side-to-side movement caused by crosswinds. Through a cable control system, pilots move the rudder by pressing pedals at their feet. Investigators know in 2 separate crashes during the 1990s, pilots lost control of their 737s because of a sudden and unexpected movement of the rudder. It's called a rudder hardover, where the rudder controls lock. Everyone on board both planes died.
Here we had an aircraft that went pretty significantly nose left where it shouldn't have. So one of the first things we want to look at is those rudder actuators.
The actuator is a crucial mechanism that converts the hydraulic pressure generated by the pilot's pedal inputs into a mechanical action that moves the rudder.
Is this situation coming back to haunt us on another 737?
If these rudder issues have resurfaced, thousands of lives on board 737s across the world could be in danger.
Okay.
The rudder did not lock up and cause the plane to veer off the runway.
Can we get the overheads up, please?
Bill English wonders what else could have caused the accident. He now focuses in on the spot where the plane started to turn left.
Next.
Does it look like the nose wheel was scrubbing?
It does.
The thick black streak came from the nose wheel. Investigators see evidence of what's known as scrubbing. Scrubbing occurs when an extreme lateral movement pushes a tire sideways across the surface, grinding the tread down. Did the steering system jam, causing the nose wheel to scrub?
Did we have something like a hard over of the nose wheel?
Investigators catch a break when a cable that controls the steering system is found at the crash site.
What do we got here?
It's broken. If the cable snapped before the crash, it would explain the nose wheels.
So why was that tire scrubbing?
Another potential mechanical factor that investigators need to consider is whether Flight 1404's brakes jammed during takeoff.
We're looking for any evidence of a lockup.
If the left brake was locked, that could pull the aircraft to the left. If you did have that, you'll see discoloration in the metal components around the brakes and the wheel hub. The examination of the brakes didn't show anything like that.
It's clear to Bill English and his investigators that whatever happened to Flight 1404 was not a mechanical failure, but something else entirely.
So where does that leave us?
You looked at the machine, now we have to look at the environment and the man, the pilots.
Damn it! Let's go back there, please.
With the cause of Flight 1404's runway excursion evading investigators, the NTSB must now consider factors outside the plane that could have contributed to the Boeing 737's fate.
We missing anything?
No. No, we got all I need.
NTSB senior meteorologist Don Ike will investigate the weather conditions at the time of the crash.
This accident occurred December 20th. This is the middle of the winter. We're going to be looking at the runway, the environment, the winds, any precipitation.
Reports from the National Weather Service indicate there was a low-pressure system in parts of Colorado around the time of the crash.
Winter runway contamination is always a concern and a question which occurs due to winds, snow, water.
But it had no impact on Denver Airport. There was no severe weather at the time. Runway 34's surface was bare and dry.
Well, whatever it was, it happened real fast.
Investigators now turn their attention to the crosswinds during takeoff.
It looks like weather vane to me.
Weather vaning occurs when a crosswind pushes a plane's tail, causing the nose to point into the wind. A pilot must apply rudder to counteract this movement.
A 737-500 can handle crosswinds up to 33 knots. But if the gusts are stronger, it might have been enough to blow the plane off the runway.
English needs to confirm that the pilots weren't attempting to take off in crosswinds that exceeded the safety limits for the 737.
All right, cue up ATIS.
Main departure, runway 3.
Prior to takeoff, the pilots would have received the current weather conditions from the Automatic Terminal Information Service, or ATIS.
11 knots, active runway.
ATIS reported winds of 280 degrees at 11 knots, well under the 33-knot threshold. But pilots don't just rely on ATIS. Air traffic control also provides specific runway winds right before takeoff.
1404, wind 270 at 27.
Investigators speak with the controller on duty that night.
Thanks for taking the time for us.
Of course.
Okay, so what were the conditions at takeoff? Well, I checked the winds just before. Continental 1404, wind 270 at 27.
The controller told the crew to expect 27-knot winds on runway 34, a speed still below the crosswind limit of 33 knots.
Anything else that could help explain what happened? No. I'm as stumped as you guys.
It's another dead end.
Okay, let's figure this out.
If the winds were within limits and the plane was mechanically sound, that only leaves pilot error.
All good. Next.
From the plane's flight data recorder, investigators get a second-by-second breakdown of the pilot's actions.
Pilots are trained to flying crosswinds from very early in their training. So we wanted to look for the crosswind controls on the flight data recorder.
Here it is. Hey, come take a look at this. That's where he gets on the rudder.
As the airplane began to gather speed and get up over 40-50 knots, the captain began making rudder inputs and feeling for that correct amount of right rudder to compensate for the left weather vaning tendency.
The FDR data shows that as the captain feels crosswinds pushing the plane slightly to the left, he applies pressure to his right rudder pedal and brings the plane back to the center line. Veers to the left a second time. The FDR reveals the captain suddenly relaxes the rudder pedals and starts turning the control column to the right.
And then for some reason, he stops using his rudder.
Yeah, but why? Captain David Butler, 50. This guy used to land fighters on aircraft carriers. He knows about wind.
Investigators need to talk to the captain himself to hear his version of the story.
Okay. Sure you're feeling up for this?
Yeah. If the pilot had been killed, we wouldn't have a lot of insight into his actions. We'd have to infer a lot more. But in this case, we were actually able to talk to him, and he was able to tell us what he thought was going on and how that might have influenced his actions.
So, in your own words, tell me what happened.
And all of a sudden, it was like someone put their hand on the tail of the airplane and weather vaned it to the left.
Mm-hmm. So, why did you let up on the rudder then?
It wasn't responding.
As we talked to the pilot, he perceived the rudder wasn't working. But we knew it was working from the FDR.
What did you do then?
I reached for the tiller.
The tiller?
Yeah.
At low speed, pilots of larger jet aircraft steer the nose wheel by turning a tiller on the left side of the cockpit.
The pilot mentioned that he tried to use the tiller as well, which seemed to be a last-ditch effort. Try for what he could to get the airplane back at least straight on the pavement. You could see the tiller was moving to the right, but at these speeds, there really wasn't much that the tiller was going to do.
With no clear cause of the crash, investigators turn to the plane's cockpit voice recorder.
Listening to a cockpit voice recorder gives us insights into what is happening that may be different from the pilot's recollections.
Queued up? Okay. Let's hear it.
Continental 1404, Denver Tower. Runway 34 right. Position and hold. Position and hold, 34 right. Continental 1404.
The conversation in the cockpit is entirely routine as the pilots run their checklists and taxi to the runway.
Looks like you got some wind out there.
And then something jumps out at them.
Looks like you got some wind out there.
Yeah.
Look at them clouds move.
The pilots were looking up at the clouds and reporting how these low clouds at 4,000 feet were moving like at 50 knots.
Continental 1404, wind at 270, at 27, turn right, heading 020, runway 34 right, is cleared for takeoff.
Heading 020, clear for takeoff, runway 34 right, Continental 1404.
Left crosswind 27 knots.
So the pilots were aware of some strong winds aloft and were questioning the report showing winds of only 27 knots.
But with no reports of winds exceeding the plane's 33-knot threshold,
All right, look for 90.9.
the captain decides to proceed, instructing the first officer to look for a power setting of 90.9 for takeoff.
This airplane should be able to handle those kind of winds. maybe we've got some local effects, something else going on, where this aircraft experienced even higher winds than were reported.
Reject! Reject!
The CVR doesn't help explain what the captain told Bill English.
So then all of a sudden, it was like someone put their hand on the tail of the airplane and weather vaned it to the left.
Investigators are at an impasse. So far, nothing explains what happened. 04 was taking off in winds under the 30, but the fast-moving clouds observed by the pilots and the sudden drastic movement of the plane lead investigators to question the accuracy of those reports.
The next logical question is, was it a massive gust of wind? I mean, was it something well beyond the capability of the aircraft to counteract?
Investigators look into the systems that measure and report winds at Denver Airport.
So what were they being told about the winds? ATIS told them 11 knots. Oh, where did that speed come from? This weather tower, right here. Okay, that is miles from the runway. It's not very helpful.
In fact, the source of ATIS information is more than 2 miles away from the point where Flight 1404 left the runway.
In Denver's case, with all the runways, the real estate, we have a little distance issue.
The ATIS report broadcast to the pilots is augmented by a wind shear measuring system on the ground. Dozens of wind shear sensors scattered throughout the airport collect additional wind readings. Controllers use these readings to provide pilots with more localized wind information.
Continental 1404, wind at 270, at 27. The controller gave them a wind speed of 27 knots. Where does that reading come from? This sensor here, at the departure end of 34 right. It averages out wind speeds, sends them out every 10 seconds.
But the sensors near the runway don't provide the speed of every gust it records, just an average.
Average was 27 knots. Not enough to blow a 737 off at runway. Bet there's a heck of a gust in there.
So we had the wind system data that was taking observations every second, giving you a 10-second reading. That system is not designed to provide any gust information or crosswind factors.
Investigators now wonder if the close proximity of the Rocky Mountains, which lie to the west of the airport, played a role in this crash.
But when you have a nice east-west mountain range like the Rockies, that strong high mountain range with a steep slope on the eastern side will typically cause winds to go down, heat by compression, and then go back up. It creates this wave-like pattern. So we started looking at the upper air conditions, and we determined that mountain wave conditions with some strong downslope winds were occurring.
These harmonic wind patterns coming off the Rocky Mountains can create strong gusts which can be felt hundreds of miles from the mountains, and can create hazardous conditions for pilots.
We knew that it wasn't just going to be enough to answer what were the weather conditions occurring at the time of the accident.
Way more than averages.
Investigators need to confirm if a mountain wave blew into Flight 1404 as it rolled down the runway. Only a second-by-second analysis of the winds can tell them that. So they recruit experts from the National Center for Atmospheric Research to create a computer model of the winds at the exact moment of the crash, using every bit of wind data they have.
We also had them include the low-level wind shear data, which was something that hasn't been done in the past. And using this model, we came into surprising findings.
Impressive.
And it did show strong winds reaching a surface. Some of these winds were over 40 knots. all associated with mountain wave conditions.
There were gusts in excess of 40 knots out there.
But none of the airport sensors reported those gusts. Just averages every 10 seconds.
The pilot wouldn't have known.
Investigators are getting close to solving the mystery of Flight 1404. But there's still one thing they don't know. Just how strong was the gust that hit the plane?
Jack! Okay. What's it take to blow a 5810 airplane off that runway?
Investigators are determined to figure out what blew Flight 1404 off the runway.
Now we sort of work our way backwards and say, what wind exactly was affecting this aircraft?
The answer's in here somewhere.
They run hundreds of computer simulations using various possible wind gust speeds in an effort to replicate 1404's actual path.
These simulations are not animation of a little 3D airplane, but they're squiggly lines and values on a chart. Our performance engineers had to take the aerodynamic model of this airplane and back the wind out of this. It's a very time-consuming process.
Thanks. They got it. It's 45 knots.
Calculations reveal several gusts were much more powerful than the 27-knot winds reported to the pilots. Some were as high as 45 knots, or 50 miles an hour.
No trouble with the wind until they get right here, and then bam, they get hit with a 45-knot gust. That'll get your attention.
How did we get into something as seemingly simple as a crosswind runway excursion?
A wind gust? That's it?
A pilot with thousands of hours of experience, former naval aviator, been working for the airline for a long time. What's going on here? How did this happen?
Now Bill English wonders, should an experienced pilot like Captain Butler have been able to keep the plane under control?
How far outside the range of normal experience is this for airline pilots? And in order to answer that question, we had to actually get operational data.
Hey, Bill. You're not going to believe this.
The NTSB reviews data from all the 737 takeoffs they can find.
It's a once-in-a-lifetime. If that.
They discover that out of 250,000 takeoffs, only 4 737s experienced crosswinds stronger than 30 knots. That's much less than the 45-knot gust the pilots of Flight 1404 faced.
The odds that a pilot is going to encounter that kind of crosswind, it's not even guaranteed that they will encounter it in their career as an airline pilot. And they might encounter it once.
Okay, let's see how he handled it.
With this new information on wind speeds, investigators now take a second look at the captain's actions.
Okay, so let's add the gusts to the captain's rudder inputs, please. All right. He said with a small gust, applies right rudder. It works for him. Then the big one hits, right rudder again, but not enough to bring him back.
The second time, the wind is so strong, the rudder doesn't immediately bring his plane back on course. The captain assumes his rudder has stopped working.
Damn it!
During the second input, he got hit by a blast of 45 knots of wind almost directly from the left side of the airplane. And so that effectively canceled out the effect of his input. What he needed to do was put in another one. Instead, as he relaxed the rudder pedals, the airplane just began to drift in the wrong direction.
Reject!
Taking off in crosswinds is part of the routine that pilots undergo in flight simulators. But it turns out there are limits to that training.
We discovered that the simulator does not actually inject gust into the simulated wind values until you're at least 50 feet above the ground. they were training pilots, but they weren't actually getting the practice of compensating for the gusts on the ground.
And in the real world, Mother Nature will come back and grab.
So as the airplane began to veer toward the side of the runway and the captain began to panic,
Damn it!
he reverted toward sort of overlearned patterns of behavior. It is what you would do in a car if you were trying to drive away from the side of the runway.
But if the conditions were so severe, investigators need to know how the pilots of Flight 1404 ended up in this no-win situation in the first place. NTSB investigators now know that the pilots of Flight 1404 were taking off in a crosswind they've probably never experienced before. What they need to know now is why nobody told them about the powerful gusts that day.
We've checked the wind readings at the time of the crash.
Some gusts clocked in a lot higher than 27 knots. If the controllers issued a higher wind value or the gust value that was reported by other sensors, would that have made a difference?
Looks like we got some wind out there.
Yeah.
Look at those clouds moving.
Continental 1404.
Wind 270 at 27.
Controllers have a ribbon display terminal which shows up to 7 different wind readings. One is the wind speed detected by the sensor closest to the far end of the runway. That's the speed given to the crew, 27 knots. But it also shows the wind speed detected by the sensor at the near end of the runway. Just before the crash, it had reported 35-knot winds with gusts to 40.
Why didn't you report the 40-knot gusts to the pilot? We provide pilots with the departure runway winds only, but only if they ask, right? That's standard operating procedure.
He was following the policies that they had.
Standard operating procedure.
But, what it looks like is sort of a classic information transfer kind of issue where the information wasn't being passed along due to the way they had designed things and proceduralized the flow of information at the tower.
It was a combination of events that led to the crash of Continental 1404.
Receiving aircraft checklist complete. Not the APU up? Yeah.
Because the fierce gusts were so localized, the plane would not have been affected had the pilots delayed their takeoff or requested a different runway.
3-4 right. 3-4 right. That's what we want, right? Yep.
They observed this Beech 1900 takeoff ahead of them without incident. And that has a big impact on pilot decision-making. That's a phenomenon known as social proof. Everyone else is doing it, then must be all right.
Continental 1404.
Wind 270 at 27. Turn right. Heading 020. Runway 34 right is cleared for takeoff.
The pilots are given winds of 27 knots, which turn out to be much lower than what they would soon encounter.
Left crosswind 27 knots.
There was information available that would have changed the outcome if it had been communicated to the flight crew. But the way the system was designed to disseminate that information meant that it was not conveyed to them.
If the pilots were aware of the mount wave conditions, they might have been alert for some of the potential gusts.
The airplane could have been controllable even at that high gust. Had enough rudder input been put in and stayed in, it could have held on at the center line of the runway.
Damn it!
In this case, the pilot lost the association between what inputs he was making and what the aircraft was doing.
Reject! Reject! The Continental Airlines 1404 accident was significant in the fact that it was not just a normal runway excursion accident. This one occurred due to mountain wave activity. One of the key recommendations we came up with was for the FAA to study this. The hazards types of mountain waves are out there. Mother Nature's always there, and every now and then she can be violent.
The FAA made a profile that was based on crosswinds experienced by this crew, and they now require that be included in training programs.
Investigators also recommend new Federal Aviation Administration guidelines, requiring air traffic controllers to provide multiple sources of wind information to pilots.
When we start talking about severe weather, we need to remind the traveling public that airport delays may be a little inconvenience, but those events are kingpin and are environmental factors that cause accidents.
Arvind Kumar.
आदित्य रिकॉर्डिंग स्टूडियो सरवारा बाजार।
होलिया में काहे भौजी लुकाइल तू बारू, रंग डालवावे में ला जाइल काहे बारू। होलिया में काहे भौजी लुकाइल तू बारू, रंग डालवावे में डेराइल काहे बारू। अइबू नाही बहरी त ताला तोहर तुरी हसन। गाँव भर के लइका जे ऊपर नीचे रंग हसन। गाँव भर के लइका जे ऊपर नीचे रंग हसन।
आदित्य रिकॉर्डिंग स्टूडियो सरवारा बाजार।
अरविंद कुमार। करना बहाना भौजी बहरी तू आवा, लहंगा के भीतरी तू रंग डालवा। करना बहाना भौजी बहरी तू आवा, लहंगा के भीतरी ले रंग डालवा। होलिया के माजा भौजी तोहरे से लिहसन। गाँव भर के लइका आज ऊपर नीचे रंग हसन। गाँव भर के लइका आज ऊपर नीचे रंग हसन। अरविंद कुमार।
आदित्य रिकॉर्डिंग स्टूडियो सरवारा बाजार।
विष्णु अकेला तोहरा गलिया के रंगी, नीकेश निराला तोहके पाजा में धली। विष्णु अकेला तोहरा गलिया के रंगी, नीकेश निराला